Welcome to the class on artificial neural networks. Artificial neural networks is a topic you can read about in the newspapers. It's a topic you can discuss with your friends on the street. It's a topic that excites lots of people around the world. We are in the middle of the third wave of neural networks. Well, the first wave of neural networks started in the 50s, and at that time people looked at simple perceptrons and how they could learn on certain tasks. And after some years, this first wave of neural networks died because it was difficult to find learning algorithms that are useful for complicated tasks. And then the second wave of neural networks came in the 80s, and this time it was triggered by the backpropagation algorithm, which made it suddenly possible to address several much more difficult tasks. And then it died. It died because statistical methods took over, because support vector machines took over. And then about 10 years ago, we had suddenly the third wave of neural networks. And this time it is driven by computational power. Suddenly we had GPUs to simulate large networks. And we had ways to implement these large networks such that they could be trained on very complicated tasks. Suddenly big databases for training became available. And this really pushed the third wave of neural networks. And that's the wave we are still in. Neural networks now have set standards for computer vision. They have set standards for artificial intelligence. They're able to play games at an astonishing level. And overall in this class, we will cover these type of applications. Now, in this first video, we take a first step and go from biological to artificial neural networks, models of a single neuron. And then later today, in one of the next videos, I will give you also a general introduction, a couple of examples from the field, and the application of the classic simple perceptron. So let's start the transition from a biological neuron to an artificial neuron. The first wave of neural networks was inspired by the brain. The second wave of neural networks was inspired by the brain. And the third wave is as well. So where is this inspiration coming from? Suppose you look at an image, for example, image of a car. The information would enter through your eyes, and it would be processed in the back of your brain. That's the area that's called visual cortex. And then if you say, hey, actually, this looks like a car, that means you compare this with memories, which are, for example, stored in frontal cortex, but also in other areas. And while you say, well, this is a car, you actually move your muscles, and these commands are sent out in the motor cortex. And so you can say, yes, this is a car. Yes, this is another car. No, this is not a car. What is this? Well, this is a man sitting on a couch with a dog on his lap. So the description I gave so far with the different areas, visual cortex, motor cortex, frontal cortex, is a very rough description. But we can also zoom in. And if we zoom in, if we take a little cubic millimeter of cortical material and put it under a microscope, what we would see is a network of cells. This network of cells looks like a network because the cells have these long cable-like extensions so that it forms a network. And what you see here is just a tiny glance of this network. In fact, it's a very dense network. In each cubic millimeter, you would find about 10,000 of these cells. These cells are the neurons. The neurons are the cells in the brain, a major class of cells in the brain. And if you put together all these little cables, you would find 3 kilometers of wire. So what we have is a densely connected network of neurons in the brain. Now, what I took out here is one of these neurons. You see here an area that is called the soma, a part of the neuron. and this is where the essential nonlinear processing step takes place. Information would arrive on the dendrites, and information will be sent out along the axon. It will be sent out to other neurons, and this action potential is a short electrical pulse of about 1 millisecond duration, about 100 millivolt height, and this is, if you want, the unit of communication. There's a pulse or no pulse. And so here we have one of these neurons here on the right, and this neuron now receives input from a spike, an action potential of another neuron. And this is not the only input it receives. It will in fact receive input from many, many other cells. Each neuron receives inputs from 1,000 of other neurons, or more than 1,000, several thousand other neurons. Now, how can we describe this network of signals that's circulating in the networks of cells? Well, here we have one input spike coming into this cell. It will evoke a response. And if several of these input spikes arrive, what we would do is we would just add up these responses. So the neuron sums the effect of the inputs. And then in order to decide whether another of these pulses, another action potential is sent out, we compare with a threshold, theta, and if this variable u hits the threshold, then a pulse is sent out. It's sent out to many other neurons. So we have a recurrent network of these neurons. I will note down an active neuron by a red-filled circle, and you see here there's a first active neuron. It stimulates other neurons get active, and so what we have is really a wave of activity that goes through this recurrent network. So now we have a network of neurons. The neurons are these red circles, and what I now ask is, well, actually, where happens learning? You may have read in the newspapers that neural networks are able to learn. Where is the learning taking place? So we have this network of neurons, and we pick out one of these neurons. Here again, very schematically, a soma, and then the axon. This is where the information, the pulse, would go on to other neurons. And this neuron receives inputs from sending neurons over the axons of other neurons. And this contact point here is called the synapse. And now a central dogma is that the synapse has a strength. You can measure this strength by looking at the size, at the amplitude of the response to an incoming spike. And this size of the response, this amplitude is not fixed, but it can change. And learning is a change of connection strength, a change in the size of this response. So the efficacy of the connection changes due to learning. So whatever you learn, whether it's memorizing new facts, whether it's learning to play the piano or learning to ski down the hill, it's thought to be implemented by changes in the connections between neurons, implemented in the changes of the synapses. So now this gives a system of computation which is quite different to that of a classical computer. In the brain, you have a highly distributed architecture, and the memory is in the connections. So it's not that there is one separate part where the memory sits. The memory sits in the synaptic weights, it sits in the connections, and that means there is no separation of processing and memory. It's a distributed architecture where processing, the sending of the decision whether a neuron sends out a spike, sends out a pulse, is happening distributed by the neurons, and where also the memory is distributed because it sits in the connections. We have about 10,000 connections per neuron, We have 10 billion neurons or more in the brain. It's a highly connected, dense network. So neurons and synapses together form one big recurrent network. Now, that was my glimpse of neural networks in a biological sense. But what we are interested in is artificial neural networks, and therefore we now turn to the description of an artificial neuron. So here's my network again, and I just remind you that these neurons communicate by spikes, by short pulses. Each pulse causes a response. We sum up the responses and we compare with a threshold value. If this threshold is hit, then the receiving neuron sends out a pulse on its own, and this pulse would go to many, many other neurons in the same network. So what we want to retain from this little image is that responses are added, that pulses are created at the threshold, and then they are transmitted to other neurons. And now we turn this into a mathematical description, but to that we will forget about spikes. We just work with a continuous activity, and so here is the continuous activity of an input neuron with index k, and then I have the continuous activity xi of an output neuron. Then I have my synapses, the synaptic connections. They have a weight, and this weight is the weight wik from k to I. Note the direction of these arrows. So it goes from k to I. The ordering of the index is inspired by matrix notation. And then we said neurons have a threshold, and therefore we allow for some nonlinear processing step g of the total input, and the total input is sum over k, wik, xk. Now, I told you that in the biological picture, these synapses are not fixed. They can change their efficacy. That means for us, these weight values are not fixed. They can change. And so the weights are adaptive parameters. So this is one of the two things we take from biology. The weights, the synapses, are the adaptive parameters. And the other thing that we take from the biology is that the processing of a neuron is a combination of a linear sum and a nonlinear processing step that sort of models the threshold of the neuron. And now we arrive at the end of this first video. Many videos in this lecture series end with a quiz. So I suggest that you pause the video for a moment and you make your decisions. These are 5 independent questions. Each is binary, yes or no. And then I will walk you through the answers. So please take a moment to think, to reflect what you want to answer, and then we go through it together. So the first question is, neurons in the brain have a threshold. Is that correct? And then learning means a change in the threshold. Is that correct? Learning means a change in the connection weights. Well, what we have seen is that neurons have a threshold, and learning implies a change of connection weights. Now, the total input to a neuron is the weighted sum of individual inputs. And yes, this is correct. Finally, the neural network in the brain is feed-forward. It has no recurrent connections. It has no loops. It always goes in one forward direction. And this is obviously wrong. The neural network in the brain has recurrent connections. It makes lots of loops. It's definitely not feed-forward. Why do I bring up this question? Because in artificial neural networks, you often see layered networks with a pure feed-forward structure. That means connections do not form loops. But that's not true for the biology.